Anaxagoras, 500 BC to 428 BC. Anaxagoras of Clazomenae is the first of the movement known as the pluralists. Anaxagoras is the prototypical example of the natural philosopher who challenged the religious dogmatists. His influence on Socrates was profound in this way. Anaxagoras was from Persia, but was forced to flee to Athens. Persia was a country ruled by sun worshippers who would not have accepted the Anaxagorean theory that the sun was a burning ball of metal. Anaxagoras lived in Athens for many years after this, and considered himself an Athenian, but eventually came into conflict with the religious dogmatists there too. He fled Athens a few years before his death. When someone remarked that it was a shame for him to die in exile, Anaxagoras said, quote, "The descent to Hades is much the same from whatever place we start." End quote. Anaxagoras was influential in both the example of his life and his character on two of the most important Hellenic Greeks, Socrates, as we've mentioned, and Pericles. Socrates was influenced by his willingness to challenge the religious dogma of the Athenians in the name of truth, but Nietzsche argues that the greatest Anaxagorean of all was Pericles. What Pericles learned from Anaxagoras was, above all, his demeanor, the way that Anaxagoras presented himself, the way that Anaxagoras walked and moved and spoke, his gestures and his bearing. This is what Pericles learned. Anaxagoras was known to never smile, to speak and comport himself with a sort of awe-inspiring dignity. Pericles was the Athenian general who led his people through the Spartan siege of the city of Athens during the Peloponnesian War, and he's best known for his funeral oration. In this speech, he stirred the spirit of the Athenians to fight on, imploring his countrymen to remember that Athens was the greatest of the Greek city-states and the educator of the entire Hellenic world. The character of Pericles is a demonstration of the Anaxagorean philosophy. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Pericles was, as it were, the visible human incarnation of the building, moving, eliminating, ordering, reviewing, artistically undetermined force of the mind." End quote. Further in the same passage, Nietzsche continues, arguing that Pericles emulated the qualities of Anaxagoras when, quote, "as a public orator, he stood before his people, and the beautiful rigidity and immobility of a marble Olympian, and now, calm, wrapped in his mantle, with unruffled drapery, without any change of facial expression, without smile, with a voice the strong tone of which remained ever the same." End quote. Perhaps my favorite of Nietzsche's descriptions of Pericles is when Nietzsche writes that Pericles did not merely speak, but, quote, "thundered, struck with lightnings, annihilated and redeemed," end quote. And it is in this way that Pericles embodies the Anaxagorean chaos, a concept which we will examine in a moment. Anaxagoras' central idea can be approached in several ways, but one of its most significant points is that Anaxagoras conceives not of being, but of beings, plural. Hence, pluralism. It's an error in our thought, a false path to answer the question, what exists, by searching for one existent, rather than recognizing the obvious inductive truth, there are multiple existents. Anaxagoras therefore rejects the oneness of being that's put forward by Parmenides. He conceives not of the one, but of the all. One could say that the pure theory of being that characterizes Parmenides too is, in effect, the ultimate consequence of the monistic style of thought that had been followed by all of the Pre-Platonics up to this point. We start down this road by searching for one fundamental type of matter, the same road that Thales travels upon. But we end by asserting that there is literally only one thing, one being, one existence, the one. And the consequence of this is that we must say all of the other apparent phenomena are illusory. Anaxagorean philosophy rejects this monism as a fundamental flaw. The first major innovation of Anaxagoras can be seen in his response to Anaximander. For Anaximander, the fundamental being is qualityless. For Anaxagoras, the noumenon is not the absence of qualities, but asserted to be a mix of all qualities. This is the Anaxagorean chaos. Nietzsche writes, quote, Anaxagoras conceives of the world's primal existence, perhaps as similar to a dust-like mass of infinitely small, concrete particles, of which every one is specifically simple and possesses one quality only, yet so arranged that every specific quality is represented in an infinite number of individual particles. End quote. The Anaxagorean chaos, importantly, does not reduce the many to the one, and furthermore, Anaxagoras posits the idea that the all is contained in the all, as he put it. The substances that make up one type of being, or one type of phenomena, are contained in the others. What we call becoming is a transformation of matter from one form into another, and Anaxagoras' intuition is based on what he can observe. Even apparently opposite qualities transform into one another. That which is hot becomes cold. White could be absorbed into black. In rock being worn away and eroded, the hard can become soft. In a newly sprouted plant growing into a towering tree, the soft can become hard. Minerals can be absorbed by the body and become flesh, and so on and so forth. These qualities are not themselves essential, but contain one another. In an important way, the so-called false path of Parmenides may have yielded at least some useful conclusion, insofar as Anaxagoras also rejects arising and passing away, in the sense meant by Anaximander and Heraclitus, that things literally come into being and then go out of being, or go from being to non-being. Becoming is redefined by Anaxagoras as an all, many existent things which through mixture and separation, which are his two main principles for describing the behavior of matter, through mixture and separation, the different phenomena combine, aggregate, dissolve, and disaggregate. Nietzsche writes, quote, The older theory was that one element explains all things, that all qualities ultimately lead back to one quality, be it air or fire. On the other hand, Anaxagoras now maintains mixture and separation in accord with his theory. Through ever so much mixing together, something unlike can still be extracted from the like. The universe is full of different qualities. These exist, therefore they must be eternal. He perceives the actual world as true being. All its qualities must eternally exist. There are never more or less. End quote. So, rather than seeing one primal or fundamental type of being, one primordial state of being, such as water, we might say the moist, right? Or dampness, wetness. Rather than seeing heat and fire and all these other things as rarifications of water, just to compare the thought of Anaxagoras to Thales, he would say, well, clearly both heat and cold exist. They must both be within the primordial state of being, so to speak. They must both be eternal qualities. One is not a derivation or transformation of the other. All such qualities that we can identify must eternally exist. Still, the problem of motion remains. It has never been satisfactorily answered so far. Or rather, every attempt at answering it has relied on a previous metaphysical explanation, all of which elucidates some things but obscure others. For Anaxagoras to suggest that the fundamental mode of being is chaos, that the all contains the all, why does this transformation occur? Why does movement occur? Nietzsche puts the problem this way, quote, The delicate question must be raised. If there are many substances, and if these many move, what moves them? Do they move one another? Or is it perhaps only gravitation? Or are there magic forces of attraction and repulsion within the things themselves? Or does the cause of motion lie outside these many real substances? Or putting the question more pointedly, if two things show a succession, a mutual change of position, does that originate from themselves? And is this to be explained mechanically or magically? Or if this should not be the case, is it a third something which moves them? End quote. We could say that Anaximander answered this question moralistically. Movement, coming into being, is a kind of immoral theft from being. You could see movement as a kind of fault in the indefinite, but one which is inevitably corrected. We could conceive of it sort of like a vibration of things going into existence and then out again. Like a bow that you pluck, it vibrates, but that it returns to the center. It returns to that state of stasis. For Heraclitus, change is the logos. It's the law of the phenomenal world. It is simply the fundamental nature of reality to exist as strife and hence change. Therefore, it requires no explanation. It's simply a play of forces. For Parmenides, change is an illusion. He deals with the problem by saying there is no strife, there is no motion. Anaxagoras does not have recourse to such moralistic or magical explanations or such thus-so explanations as Heraclitus. For Anaxagoras, the movement of the universe is the operation of what he calls Noose. And this is a word that Nietzsche says is untranslatable because it is a concept which is, quote, authentically Greek, end quote. It's usually translated as mind or intellect. Nietzsche suggests that Noose indicates a direct sensation or an unmistakable apprehension. In Homer's Odyssey, for example, Noose is the place where a character will say their anger is felt. So, for example, if we were to render Noose as heart instead of mind, we might utter the phrase, "My anger wells in my heart, happiness springs in my heart. My anger wells in the noose, happiness springs in the noose." One knows their anger, their happiness through the noose. It's self-awareness of one's own emotional state. That's a kind of knowing, but it's a direct subjective sense of knowing, which is what Nietzsche emphasizes as the nous of Anaxagoras. It's mind in this sense to which Anaxagoras attributes the motion of the universe. It's not mind as a sort of deliberated, self-conscious reason, but something more akin to a direct sense. Noose could be compared to Spinoza's conatus or to Giordano Bruno's world soul. Bruno's explanation for the movement of the heavens was that the heavenly bodies have a divine spark in them, just like animate beings. Similarly, Noose, quote, produces a circular motion or vortical movement on one point of mass, which immediately expands outward and pulls ever larger parts into its range, moving ever farther outward, end quote. The explanation for motion is thus not found in matter in itself, but in the nous which moves the matter according to this circular regularity. This underlying world will, we might call it, also bears similarity to the logos of Heraclitus, insofar as it is a form of order. For Nietzsche, quote, this is the important idea of Anaxagoras, that rotation suffices in order to explain all order and regularity in the universe. Only in this way does intellect affect order, or so says Aristotle, end quote. It's easy to see the way in which the Anaxagorian perspective could slide toward dualism, we might say, depending on whether one considers matter and nous to be two different substances. If one assents to that, then you would be in the camp of the Cartesian dualists. This is a sort of very old debate that has continued throughout the entire history of Europe. There's mind and there's matter, and people like Descartes said that they're both separable and ultimately have a different essence, and then people like Bruno and Spinoza said that fundamentally they were the same substance or essence, just simply in different attributes. Perhaps the remarkable thing about Anaxagoras is precisely how he establishes a kind of unity in the world of matter, in spite of the fact that he seems to be more among the camp of the Cartesian dualists, if we were to use apocryphal language to describe him. Anaxagoras says that the all is contained in the all, that these multiple existents, these multiple lumps of being, so to speak, are all the same fundamental nature as one another. They don't have to be permutations of some form or another of material. The laws and processes that govern the existence of one form of matter govern every form. All existents are material in nature. The nous is sort of like a disembodied law, so to speak. It is not itself another form of matter. Nietzsche writes, quote, those wholly isolated, thoroughly heterogeneous, and eternally unalterable substances were after all not conceived as being absolutely heterogeneous, but all had, in addition to a specific wholly peculiar quality, also one absolutely homogeneous substratum, a piece of space-filling matter. In their participation in matter, they all stood equal and therefore could act upon one another, i.e., knock against one another. Change did not in the least depend on the heterogeneity of those substances, but on their homogeneity, as matter." End quote. At this point, even though I've said at the outset I didn't want to delve too deeply into Nietzsche's considerations regarding the Pre-Platonics from the standpoint of its significance to science and the Pre-Platonics as creators of a materialist worldview in ancient Greece, we can begin to see the outlines of the kind of materialist perspective that we'd probably associate with post-Enlightenment modernity, more so than with the ancient world, here in the philosophy of Anaxagoras. This natural philosophy of pluralism is that first step into the framework of atomism. Again, Nietzsche is not fully without his criticisms of Anaxagoras. His notion of the mind as nous, the driving force, still is somewhat a recourse to the inexplicable, at least insofar as Anaxagoras leans heavily on the fact that the power of the nous is arbitrary. The problem of motion as it comes to us when considering the Anaxagorian chaos is more than anything a problem of first causes, of putting to ourselves the question of why motion would begin in the first place, why transformation, change, strife would begin. And Nietzsche, for his part, describes Anaxagoras somewhat charitably, even as he acknowledges these rough edges in his thought. Nietzsche does so by reminding us that the pre-Platonic philosopher was still a kind of artist. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Here, of course, one might ask, what fancy had at that time so suddenly occurred to the nous to knock against some chance material particle out of that number of particles, and to turn it around in whirling dance, and why that it did not occur to it earlier?" Whereupon Anaxagoras would answer, "The nous has the privilege of arbitrary action. It may begin at any chance time. It depends on itself, whereas everything else is determined from outside. It has no duty, and no end which it might be compelled to pursue. If it did once begin with that motion and set itself an end, this was, after all, only, the answer is difficult, Heraclitus would say, play." That seems always to have been the last solution or answer hovering on the lips of the Greek. The Anaxagorian mind is an artist, and in truth, the most powerful genius of mechanics and architecture, creating with the simplest means the most magnificent forms and tracts, and as it were a mobile architecture, but always out of that irrational arbitrariness which lies in the soul of the artist. It is as though Anaxagoras was pointing at Phidias, and in the face of the immense work of art, the cosmos, was calling out to us as he would do in front of the Parthenon. Becoming is no more, but only an artistic phenomenon. End quote. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.